But I mustn't forget to thank all the people who supported us. First of all, I want to thank you, the Foreign Federal Office of Germany, for the financial support, and the Übersetzerhaus Loren in Switzerland. But also, it wouldn't have been possible to gather and to make this possible, this gathering of 9 authors from 7 different African countries in these crazy times. If we hadn't the collaboration with the KfW Foundation, KfW Foundation, KfW Stiftung in Frankfurt, and the working together with my dear colleague Daniela Leykam was really very fruitful. Thank you very much for this. And the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, and a very warm welcome from my side as well. It's been a super enriching collaboration for us as well, so we're very honored to celebrate your 40th anniversary Litprom here today and use this occasion to discuss and get an outlook on what's to come. I have a few things to say and people to introduce. First of all, I'd like to ask Marcella Melien behind the Q&A tool to give us a quick wave. She's across the table from me. Hi, Marcella.
Hi. Hi. I will get your questions and pass them on to the panelists later.
Thank you, Marcella. And I'd also ask Kai for a quick wave. Kai is our technical host today, and we'll make sure we have a smooth operation here all together. Kai. And of course, a very, very warm welcome to all speakers. What we will do is I'll say your name and please give a quick wave into the camera so all our guests can link a face to a name. So we will start with José Eduardo Agualusa, I believe, who is in Maputo today. Please wave, Eduardo. Then Hemley Boum, gratefully joining us from La Réunion. I have also Colleen Higgs on the list from Cape Town in South Africa. Bettina Gappa, I believe, from Scotland, if I'm not mistaken. Then Maaza Mengiste joining us from New York. Thank you, Maaza. Time difference here is quite something. Yvonne Obua is not with us yet, I think. She will join us a little later. She's still in another Zoom call because things are busy these days. It's book fair time and literature is happening across the globe. Niaikwai Parks from London today. And Koleka Putuma from Cape Town as well. Hello, Koleka. And of course, Anna Jäger, our wonderful moderator who guided us through both panel discussions. She's joining us from Berlin. Hello, Anna. And of course, also a warm welcome to our German-speaking guests, which today are Professor Frank Schulze-Engler, Florian Kniffka, and Professor Manfred Loimeier. So as we are quite a group today, allow me to just give a couple of guidelines on how we want to do this together here today. First of all, dear speakers, dear writers, panelists, give a quick wave, just like this, or raise your hand digitally if you want to react to something or address a question yourself. Also, if you're addressing your fellow speakers, just make sure to say some names so people know that you're talking to them. And dear viewers, dear guests, we encourage this to be an open dialogue. Please ask away your questions. You can use the Q&A tool. You can also rate other people's questions if you believe they're worthy of being asked. And Marcella will do her best to pass them on throughout the discussion. We will try our best to answer as many questions as possible. A couple of notes on languages today. We will use the English language as a golden tool for communication. Please bear with us. If you are a German, a guest joining us from Germany today and feel more comfortable asking your question in German, we'll try our best to translate it. We also would like to welcome Michael Kegler, who is in the background here, who will support us building bridges between Portuguese, English, and German today. Just keep in mind that everyone has different mother tongues, and this will be a global gathering today. I think this is enough of introduction. Just one last remark. We are recording this session to make it available afterwards. Dear guests, if you can ask a question anonymously, if you do not like your name to appear anywhere. This is just last remark. So thank you so much. I'm passing on the word to Anna now. Thank you, Anna.
Hello, thank you very much, and hello to everyone. Lovely to see you, and you're all looking well in these tense times, so that's a beautiful moment to see your faces again, those that I can see. Again, a warm invitation to really join this conversation. The idea is not that I'm moderating through this again, but it is challenging, and us seeing just some of us in the squares. So please, again, be very invited to come with questions and answers and thoughts. And I take this privilege of being in that role to share a thought with you that might be quite obvious, but for me it was very important to state it again. And it's also something that in the preparation I spoke about with Anita a bit, and that is within all these global connections and these international topics that clearly also we have talked in the conversations. This is also, although happening digitally, happen in a local context, in a very local context also of Germany. And I just wanted to acknowledge that what often happens due to lack of time and the compression of these things, that there are again these dichotomies which are very much tied to historical power structures. And these dichotomies then often include an assumed audience, an assumed, publishing landscape, and an assumed ridership, group of writers. And what happens often in Germany is then that the assumed readership for which books have to be translated, and by that I mean beyond languages, I mean a translation as a much wider undertaking, that the assumed readership is white. And that also the assumed literary landscape in Germany is white, which is not true. And there are people who need to be acknowledged for an amazing work they have been doing since the mid-70s, some of them, like the Orlando Frauenverlag, a women's publisher that has been run partially by women of color and that have published Audre Lorde, Melien, a lot of very important voices within the German literary landscape, but also internationally in translations. There have been endeavors like Charmaine Longgrove's dialogue book, which has started 12 years ago in Berlin and is now between the UK and Germany. She has just returned to Berlin with her publishing house. And so I think this is very important, although quite obvious, but often in a German discourse, still worth mentioning that very active, engaged, and successful publishers, distributors, and also critics in this country are part of the landscape and thriving it forward as well. And I think this is true for a lot of other publishing and literary landscapes within Europe and beyond. And I just wanted to acknowledge that thought again. Same is true for academics, working on all these different literary products and books and publications. That as a thought that from having had some time to ripe, I wanted to mention. Ngugi is not here now, but I wanted to share a memory or something that I would have asked him, and that I can also give to the round of writers and publishers and panelists that we've talked. But what I would have shared with him is a meeting that is maybe one-sided we had exactly 10 years ago in Nairobi, me meeting him not meeting me, during a lecture he gave in Nairobi in the context of the Kwani Lit Fest that happened then. And he did something astonishing then to me, being familiar with his works, but not with that encounter that he did with these very young students that were sitting there filling that hall, hundreds of them. And he asked a couple of questions about their familiarity in reading in their mother tongue. And he went, also from different languages that are spoken and written and read in Kenya, Kikuyu, Luo, Kiswahili, different languages. And the smaller the language got, of course, but also, within the Nairobi context, the less people showed hand signs, in how they are used, how the language is used in everyday language, how it was used maybe in school, and if they had read books in that language, and then going to the university level, if books in their own language, in their own mother tongues had been taught, and they were invited to read. And in this massive auditorium of hundreds of people, I remember the show of hands of those who read privately for their own pleasure in their mother tongues were maybe 4 maximum. So that was, I think for everyone, a very impressive survey. So, taking that also as a point that we have slightly talked about, but the question of publishing in African language also includes, I guess, the languages that are taught as a literary languages in school and universities. So I wanted to ask, because Hemley, you talked about the rights for your book and the importance of having it also and having your books published in African countries, but also in African literatures. If you see that there is also a push by publishers to get into the curriculum, because often the most powerful publishers on the African continent are those that publish for schools and academia. You're muted still. Could you please activate your mic?
Is it okay for you?
Perfect.
D'accord. The question you ask is very interesting, because I've asked it for myself. In my country, we have 200 different languages, and they are not written. Spoken language is not written. And I'm sure I can say very complex things in my mother tongue, but I'm not sure I can write it this way. Speaking your language is not the same thing like having être alphabétisé, knowing how to read it. And there is a lot of disparities in Africa between countries on in this aspect. I wanted my books to be available in Africa because it's my first public. I'm talking about Africa. I'm talking about my country, and I want them to know what I'm writing. But the books were too expensive for people, so we decided to work with avec un éditeur sur place, an editor there, who will put the books for a lower price, and it works. But the books are in French, of course, and I hope we will do it. And we are trying to do it also for the English part of Africa, for the Portuguese part of Africa, etc. But we are staying on those Western languages because people there are a lot of people reading those languages, not the same with the African one. I'm so sorry. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say.
Perfectly.
It's not easy because talking about French, Kateb Yassine, who is an Algerian writer, was saying, le français c'est notre butin de guerre, means French is our, spoil of war, because of all this violence coming from colonization. And now you have new writers, not even new, but who doesn't want that spoil, who want to talk on their mother language, the rhythm of their mother language, They want to translate it in what they write. And it's a big challenge for Africa because it's a big place with a lot of language, a lot of different language, a sort of Balkanization of the languages that make things difficult to implement.
Thank you. Any more thoughts about the possibilities and the impossibilities of teaching and learning and reading and all these in this richness of languages? It's a bit tricky because I also can't see everyone, so please just join if you feel like it. Or if there are any questions. Yeah, Annie.
I mean, I think I said when we spoke earlier that there's a whole political and infrastructural effort that's been put into making sure that the colonial languages are what they are. And the same effort is reflected in the way that the countries that exist are not really countries that were formed naturally. And within that, you have what Hemley's called the Balkanization. And the word itself comes from a similar split up that came after the dominance of the Soviet Union broke in Eastern Europe. And so with those structures, there's also philosophies about what it means for something to be successful, about scale, that if you publish a book and it only sells 50 copies, it means it's not successful. All of these things work against these languages being celebrated and being published for and being catered for. So it's not a simple thing. It's nothing to do with the languages. This is all politics. And we may talk about initiatives and people in universities who are writing academic papers about these languages, but it doesn't mean anything to people on the streets. And also, people don't necessarily have to read a language in order to participate in the joys of its storytelling. So we should also be flexible in how we tell these stories. If one culture thinks that writing is the most important thing in the world, it doesn't mean all cultures believe that. And that's why certain cultures have remained oral, because it means that for the transmission of a story, there has to be an emotional connection and an investment of time with someone to tell them the stories, not necessarily sending them away with a piece of paper. So all of these things, there's a politics, there's a philosophy, all of these things have been institutionalized and we've been taught them. And in order for this to go backwards, we have to unlearn so many things. And I don't know that the powers that control literature want these things to happen necessarily. And so for those of us that want to make a difference, it's a constant fight. And so that needs to be understood. So I think what Hemley is doing is amazing, but to ask her to do anything faster or more than she's doing, you have to understand just the forces against which he's working just to make things even slightly more accessible, just based on price. So that's just one level before you get into variety. So it's a very complex landscape, but let us not make it seem like this is kind of because Africans don't value their language or their stories. No, there's a whole system that they have to carry, throw on the ground, break up before they can start again.
Your mic is muted.
Usual thing. So sorry, now unmuted. There was just a question for Nee coming up, which I thought might fit now. It's from Martina Barth, and the question is, Nee, I was very touched this afternoon when you mentioned you feel in a way guarded or sheltered by your language because there are no expressions for words which may hurt you and others. How does that consciousness influence your writing?
I'm not sure how it does, because it's something I've always had. I've always had my language. So it's not something new that I can reflect on how it affects my writing, because your writing is a kind of extension of your thinking. My thinking from the moment I was able to express myself included my language. So I'm not sure how it affects it. I would say that a reader might be able to infer some differences between somebody who perhaps doesn't speak my language and only speaks one language, but I mean, all of those things are conjecture. So all I will say is that it's important to understand my writing from the context of the fact that I've always had my own language in addition to other languages that I've picked up along the way. And I think that's the reality for most people who have multiple languages. We don't know any different. So to conjecture on how that might affect our writing is not a natural thing. It's something that we can intellectualize, maybe on reflection or something like that. But quite frankly, if I'm to be honest, I can't tell you how it affects my writing. I can only say that I feel blessed to have what I have. And my instinct to share stories is linked to my own language as well. And there's an impetus for some stories that comes from my language. Whether or not those impetuses exist in other languages, I couldn't tell you because my impetus comes from my language. So it's a very strange thing. I mean, I think, to understand stories, we need to understand that everybody has stories, and that's the starting point. So some of the things, it's almost like we're not curiosities. I think smaller languages, if we want to call them that, which is basically languages that have been brutalized other languages, are not curiosities. They're languages on their own. Nobody who's an individual speaker of a language cares how many other people speak the language, as long as the people they care about speak the language. So nobody's sitting in a village in Eritrea thinking, I don't think 1 billion people speak my language, so I'm not happy speaking it. Right? So that's the reality. When we boil things down, in the same way that when we tell stories, we come through the individuals, talk about the world, it's the same way our relationship with language is an individual relationship with each person we speak a language with. Because language is also not just the words, it's also the history, it's also the emotion, it's also the context of learning something from somebody. It's also food, music, there's so many things involved in that. So it's a very complex thing. And I think that sometimes we undersell or underplay or diminish the importance of things by trying to intellectualize them, because they're really, really complex. Languages, like humans, are very, very complex.
Thank you. Should we have another audience question, or Anna, do you want to continue?
I think we had a couple of questions from Lizzie at Tree.
Yes, we have. Martina is saying, Nee, thanks for the detailed and honest answer. And the next question we have here is for Koleka. And it's from Lizzie at Tree, and it's about your new poetry collection and its availability as an audible version. And the question is, what do writers think, or maybe you, Koleka, what do you think about the potential for audio to cross the boundaries that written literature and local languages present?
Sorry, as you might hear a couple of cars because I'm in a car, so you might just hear a train or a car or something happening during this session. But as this other conversation was happening, a few things were coming to mind, and one of them was a conversation because we've just released the audio book version of Collective Amnesia about a week ago, a few days ago, and during the launch, I was having a conversation with another poet, Upile Chisala, and in the discussion, there were a couple of questions about since the actual physical copy of Collective Amnesia has been translated into multiple languages, people were kind of wondering, okay, will you now be interested in the audio book version being done in multiple languages or you doing it in other languages. And I was joking with a friend saying that, you know, maybe for the 4th or 5th book, I might just write that book in isiXhosa, which is my mother tongue, and then have that translated into English. And she kind of joked that, you know, that, and we were also talking about how the translated versions of book is not necessarily the thing that sells, that you might necessarily, like in another country, you might sell, like, that selling is not the reason why people translate books, for example, or well, for some authors anyway. And she was making a joke that, you know, writing a book in isiXhosa and translating it into English, the English version of that translation might just be your best-selling translation yet. And I found that funny and interesting because I thought about how translation or converting a book into something else is, how much of that is about how much we want to understand the person who's being translated and not so much what is being translated, or how much it is that we are yearning to understand what it is that that person has to talk about and not necessarily like the thing that's being spoken about, how much translation has to do with the people that we translate or the people that we want to understand. That was an interesting thought that came up when she was making that joke. In terms of the audio book and what is possible with that, I mean, I think it's been interesting to make work and to also do weird things like this, because right now I'm looking at a screen with like a drawing of what should be a person and I can't see, and to be able to see other people I have to kind of scroll through my screen. To be able to do these kinds of events digitally without seeing people, without engaging with people in a physical space, so we can't necessarily physically gather and I can't necessarily be there and read from Collective Amnesia. But what's interesting with the audio book version of Collective Amnesia has been the ability to be present without actually being present at festivals or at things where I have to read poetry, but also that it is, you are asking of people to read your book from back to front by listening. So in a sense, it's kind of going back to the core of storytelling, which is what storytelling is or was, and having a whole book travel into different spaces without thinking about the other kind of logistical things that you would think about a physical book. And that's been kind of interesting, and also being able to cultivate worlds that are specific to poems, and being able to facilitate a very particular kind of experience for the audience in a way that you wouldn't be able to do, let's say, if I was standing in front of you with a microphone. And that's been an interesting thing to explore and experiment with the audiobook. I guess I'd say that that's been the one possibility.
Thank you.
We had another question coming in from Amélie. Maybe that might be a good addition.
Yeah, it kind of follows up on that. It's a question to all panelists, so whoever wants to answer can do that. Concerning physicality, spoken literature, etc. I'm interested in the relationship between literature and community and the forms it takes. What are your thoughts on that?
So it's always easier to address someone directly.
Yeah.
Est-ce que je voudrais juste dire quelque chose. Je pense souvent que le livre n'est pas forcément la meilleure manière, effectivement, de toucher certaines communautés. I'm not sure that literacy as it exists now with this classical way of doing things is the best way of going through our communities. I'm sure they can understand what is books talking about, but I'm not sure they're really interested on it. I've seen that when they have books talking about their own stories in a sort of language they can be touched on, it's different. So it can be books, or it can be audio, or it can be theater, or poetry, or music, or something else. We have also to think about different way of telling our stories. There are different ways of telling our stories, telling our own stories our own way. We are educated on this Western way of doing, of presenting our work or our stories, but I can see now that African writers are really working about how to do things differently to touch a specific public, and they assume that touching this public is also a way of touching the world. These people waiting for their story to be written. It's also the world. Il y a quelque chose dans la singularité de l'histoire qu'on raconte qui en fait un universel. Et aujourd'hui, nous devons réfléchir, et nous réfléchissons, il y a beaucoup de choses qui se mettent en place. Nous devons réfléchir à comment est-ce que nous allons écrire cette histoire. Ni disait tout à l'heure que tout ce qu'il écrit est imprégné de sa langue. Et Koleka, c'était extrêmement intéressant parce qu'il y a des initiatives comme celle-là aussi au Cameroun qui consistent à dire comment allons-nous faire par l'audio ou par le cinéma, le théâtre, la poésie, par d'autres types de langage, comment allons-nous mettre à disposition ce que nous écrivons. Et c'est vrai c'est beaucoup plus important que 4 personnes qui peuvent lire, comme vous racontiez tout à l'heure, Anna, l'histoire avec Ngugi wa Thiong'o, où il y avait dans une salle de 200 personnes que 4 personnes qui pouvaient entendre sa langue. Au-delà de ça, qui pouvaient la lire en fait, qui pouvaient lire sa langue. Au-delà de lire, c'est-à-dire avec un alphabet classique, il y a d'autres façons de faire passer la littérature. Et ces façons-là aussi peuvent et doivent être explorées.
Merci.
Maybe have a short summary of what Hemley just said. Okay, maybe a very short version, and of course not as beautiful as you have put it, but for those that are not fluent in French, that again, this stands for that there are so many ways of living and contributing in a literary way of telling stories in a community. And that is by one, yes, performance, but also you can think about cinema and many other ways, and that this is already happening. And it might be more interesting to have this touching point of stories being told and to reach out to a community that is bigger than the 4 people who are, practicing of reading in that language. It's a very compressed version now.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, though. That's very helpful. Again, we are in a global language situation here, so thank you for doing this. Okay, we have more questions. Do you want to ask the next one, Marcella?
Yes, that's again from Lizzie, and the question goes to Maaza. And first of all, congratulations on the Booker Prize shortlisting from all of us, I think. Yes. Do you think, do you think this prize, the shortlist, will have any impact on whether your book will be read in Addis? I understand books are hard to get a hold of there. Will bootleg copies make it to the marketplace? What do you think?
They're already there.
Okay.
They are there. And, it really brings up an interesting question, though. I do think it is making its way there. It will be in bookshops, if not now, it's on its way within the next week or so. So I'm really glad about that. But I think the larger questions here, the larger question really deals with the accessibility of books on the continent and how expensive they are. And for writers like myself who are diasporic, but see Africa as, you know, the place where our imagination grew and was born, and it really is my imaginary, the home for my imagination. I want my books there. So this is really a question about publishing and distribution on the continent and how we can enable this as Africans. I'm a little bit frustrated and tired of you know, the constant look towards the West for these answers. And I'm trying to, you know, there are groups of people on the continent, writers, African writers, who are working on ways to make something that's viable within their countries, speaking specifically to the different conditions of those countries and then the literary needs of the communities. And I'm encouraged by what I've been seeing. If there's anything that the coronavirus has done, it has forced different kinds of conversations. I think, like Koleka was saying, it has forced different kinds of conversations about now what can we do, since borders have been demolished with technology, since we don't have to worry about visas, since we can speak to each other across time zones without being in the same physical space. What can those of us on the diaspora do with those who are on the continent to continue to build the literary world? I find it an exciting time for literature, that we are having these conversations without necessarily needing to be at a European festival or to be invited or to be at a European residency. There's a bookstore that just opened in Angola, and I'm sure José Eduardo Agualusa knows it, Kiela, that's opened by Onjaki, a brilliant writer. This is something that's happening for Angolans, by Angolans, bringing books from across the continent of Africa. And sometimes it's Onjaki sending out an email and saying, can you get your books into a suitcase of somebody who's traveling to Angola? This is how it's happening, but it's happening. I'm encouraged by that, but unfortunately, Lizzie, as you know, until we can begin to do more of this, those bootleg copies will be running around. Yeah, so my mother is in Addis Ababa trying to find every bootleg copy so she can beat the bookseller. But but people want to read, and I'm torn by that. People want to read, and our books should be there, and they should not be paying the cost of shipping and handling that's required when the book comes from Europe or, you know, from America, which it doesn't. But how do we do that? And I think that's the next question for all of us. How do we make that happen?
I'm not sure if José, if you would like to add something to this. Michael, I'm not sure how we're going on the translation part there, but feel free to come back to us.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm always there.
Hello, everybody. I don't understand if Michael translated me in English or German.
If you want, I can try to translate it to English, and my English is so simple that even Germans will understand it.
Okay, let's try. I will speak in Portuguese. So.
This is an experiment. Thank you for bearing with us, yeah?
So, sim, eu concordo que essas experiências como o Onjaki está a tentar fazer agora, a livraria é muito nova, ainda não abriu ao público por causa desta situação do Covid, são experiências interessantes, mas muito difíceis de colocar em prática, porque não há todo um aparato político que possibilite isso, ou seja, é preciso isentar os livros de taxas, é preciso facilitar a circulação do livro, etc. Agora, é verdade também que as novas tecnologias nos ajudam hoje em dia, porque hoje nós podemos baixar os livros, é o que eu faço, eu não tenho os livros de alguns autores, é muito difícil encontrar autores anglófonos ou francófonos nas suas línguas, então eu consigo baixar esses livros para o meu iPad e leio-os, enfim, não gosto tanto, mas leio-os no meu iPad. Então, hoje em dia é mais fácil, tornou-se mais fácil que o livro circule de uma outra forma, não circule fisicamente, mas circule de uma outra forma. Então acredito que há mais autores, mais leitores angolanos, por exemplo, lendo livros de autores francófonos ou de autores anglófonos, mesmo não tendo acesso a esses livros fisicamente. Michel?
Yeah, well, I think we're all according that such initiatives like the bookstore of Onjaki is very, very useful and interesting and valuable, although it's very difficult to run this kind of bookstore, because it's not only about bringing books to Angola, it's about taxes, and it's about the missing of a political structure that helps selling, importing books and all these things. So this bookstore is not yet open to the public really, but it's beginning, and it's a hard thing to do all things like a bookstore. But the new technologies, they help a lot. Not only in communication between each other, but also in the simple fact that we can download books and read them wherever we are. I myself, I don't like it really as a medium, but I use it for getting books. I just download them. And so we can, this technological means can help to circulate books of African authors, and I'm confident that more Angolan writers, for example, are in the get into this. Sorry,
Angolan readers.
Writers and readers, yeah. Some writers are also readers. That more Angolan readers will be able to read African literature in their original language or in translation by downloading them electronically.
Thank you so much, Michel.
I think Colleen wanted to say something earlier. Is that still?
Yes. I wanted to respond to this issue of books getting into African countries. I mean, I think that there needs to be, I think writers need to consider their books being published by local publishers. So Maaza, for example, an Ethiopian publisher should be able to publish your book. And I published Bomboy by Yewande Omatozo, her first novel. And then when her second novel, when she wanted to publish her second novel, her agent, between the agent and the international publishers, they wanted to hang on to the rights, and they wouldn't let the book be published in South Africa by Mojaji Books, which had published her first book. So, I think there are those kinds of issues that happen, and that would be an interesting thing to address, more than what some of the questions I've looked at, what people were saying, and it's not mutually exclusive. And then also I think that a way of us reading each other's work would be for publishers in different African countries to publish, republish, for there to be that kind of exchange, rather than going back to the UK or to the United States and then, in English, in Anglophone Africa, and then coming back to the African country. It would be interesting to find more exchanges. And I've done a tiny bit of it, but I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. in exploring that.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple of more questions, and if the other participants would like to check them out and you can vote for them, you can press on a little thumb up, and then I will see how that other people are also interested in the answer to that question. So that will help me choose priorities. There's a general question again that maybe also catches up on what we last spoke about in the challenge of rewriting Africa. How important then are readers in Europe and translation to you? That question comes from Peter Ripken. And it's again an open question. So who would ever like to answer?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. How important are readers in Europe and translations to Europe for writers, for you writers?
For rewriting Africa, that's that?
Yeah, for rewriting Africa.
My first thought with this is rewriting Africa is rewriting Europe. You know, it's a reckoning. It's a reckoning of that first draft of history that was written by Europe to begin with. So there is no rewriting Africa without rewriting the rest of the world. And I think that the minute we begin to understand that African history is world history, and it is central to our understanding of Europe's place in the world, we understand that none of this work is happening in a vacuum, and it's not something that it's just Africans writing for themselves about themselves. It doesn't work that way. It hasn't ever worked that way. Even before, you know, colonialism, we had the trade routes that were connecting China to the Middle East, to Africa, to Greece, to everywhere. So we've never told our stories only for each other. It's we've seen the way that stories and customs have traveled from one place to another, and of course it's important, but the question might be, you know, how important is it to Europe that Africans are beginning to rewrite world history, and you know, maybe the responsibility of actually listening and making that first connection is on the other side, not to Africans reaching out.
Hemley, you want to say something about that too?
La question de quelle est la place de la littérature africaine est très présente en Europe. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a un endroit où la littérature africaine existe. There is a place where the African literature is packed and kept out of the world, the literature. So we have to exist in that world. And it can be a problem if even our people don't read. If Europeans consider that it's a special literature and they read it even if they want to read, and in some context, and our own people cannot even read us, we write for nobody. We are nothing, we are not writers. And of course, it's not the truth. Of course, we are writing stories. Of course, we are trying to tell our own stories with our own word. And as I was saying, talking about yourself is talking about the others, is talking about the world. Talking about your own village is talking about the whole world. And that's what we are saying till the first big books coming from Africa, Chinua Achebe, Cheikh Anta Diop, Césaire, everybody. That's the same thing they are saying for years to years. And I'm a little tired of the issue. I think we have already answered this question, and our elders have already answered this question. And it's time just to consider that we are also the world, and the world is in us.
I think what's also interesting is that the world is only now beginning to consider the reality that Africans have stories that they tell about the world. And the only reason why we're talking about this now is because some of these stories have made it into print. So it's almost as though if it's not in print, it doesn't exist. Because frankly, our grandparents were talking about the world with Africa as the center. So it's not revolutionary just because it's been printed. And so you have to understand where that fatigue that Hemley is talking about comes from. You have to understand when Maaza says it's Europe that should be rewriting itself. Because the reality is, if you haven't erased, then you already know that the story is there. You didn't know the story is there because you erased what was on the page. But the markings are there. We didn't come from nothing. You know, my grandmother used to tell this joke. My father's mother was one of the first official registered midwives in Ghana. And her joke was always like, I wonder who delivered me. Right? Because until you get the label from the West, that means you're not a midwife. But all these generations of people that came before her that gave birth to her were delivered safely, and yet she's the first. Or she was the first, because she's been dead a few years now. But this is precisely where we are with literature, where we are coming up with these things of, oh my gosh, it's so new. It's not new. It's just in print.
I wonder, maybe we have Zoe Beck here from Culture Book. Maybe, Zoe, you have an idea about this as someone who publishes within Europe?
Did anyone understand that question? Because I didn't.
No.
Did I drop out?
Sorry. Yes. I just had to find. I just had to press the right buttons.
Okay. I just because Ni was saying, I was saying maybe it would be interesting to hear Zoe's view on this as someone who's publishing from Europe or within Europe.
Well, no, and I was just so I just loved what Ni just said, that there is nothing new and that is just in print. And I think this is, we in Europe, we have to learn a lot, and we have to give all these things just more space, more room, and we need to print a lot more, and we have to publish a lot more. That's all I can say. And I hope we'll have this chance. So, yeah.
I think we also had a question addressed to Anita Djafari from Litprom.
Yes, we do.
That might be a good addition here.
Yes. I have no name for that question. It's sent from a Galaxy tab, that's all we know. But the question is, now there's so much excellent writing coming out of Africa, increasingly available in the north, for example, in Germany. Koleka, Putuma, Yvonne, and others. And there are great African diasporan writers like Maaza, all writing in colonial languages. Will it at some stage pose a threat to the northern writers who are writing in the same languages? Oh, the question just moved away. Or is there plenty of room in the north for everyone writing like natives in these languages?
Well, my answer is very short. There's enough room for everybody. It depends on the quality and what we have to. Well, our job is Litprom's job is to find readers, to help finding readers for all those interesting authors. That's all I can say.
Thank you. Oh,
but,
the question.
I mean, it's an interesting, maybe that, I mean, the answer can be very short, but the phenomenon of that question even coming up maybe can be discussed a bit further, that this idea of the boat is full in whichever way these restaurants in Germany very well, you know, since a couple of decades, also touches exactly on these also cultural sphere. It's just interesting, you know, to think that, and that it comes on, you know, no one would think if you give by awards or special inlays in newspapers to North American writing, that would take away, you know, from any other European writing. But if, you know, writing from, for example, African countries is read in Germany, that this is a threat even to, for example, German writers or British, white British writers, and in the North, so-called. That's just an interesting phenomenon, that there is this, you know, fear of space being taken, just as a remark, you know, why, I mean, yes, you might have to build more bookshelves in your flat or kick something else out, like some of us do, but that's
But there's also an assumption in that question, I think, with the native writers, native speakers, and the people, you know, who owns a native language? And I think that English stopped belonging to the English a long time ago. The minute they set foot on Africa, they gave up their right to claim that language as their own. The Portuguese no longer own the Portuguese language. The French lost that language a long time ago. Africans and people, you know, from the diaspora have made it their own and have claimed it in a way that is, I think, improved and stretched the boundaries of language, and in a way that would not have happened otherwise. So this idea of native is also something we have to push back against. You know, English is my native language. It's mine, and I've completely made it mine. I've bent it and done things with it. I think Chinua Achebe is also has a quote about that. And so this is our language. These languages are ours, and we're not on the outside stepping in. We have always been here, and we are now actually expanding the boundaries of this.
Yeah, thank you.
Would anyone within the group like to respond directly to this? Otherwise, we can discuss the matter of the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
I mean, we were all hoping, of course.
Yeah, there's another question from Lizzie about the Nobel Prize. It's a question that came up via Twitter from Joyce Nyaro. We keep waiting for Ngui to win the Nobel Prize. And the question is, where is the African-based and funded equivalent?
I mean, won't we have to answer a big question about exploitation of resources way before we get to that question?
You have the answer, Nee?
What, the answer to exploitation of resources? I don't believe I have the answer to that.
If I can say something about Ngugi and the Nobel, I just want to say that the Nobel need Ngugi more than Ngugi need the Nobel, definitely.
Yes.
So I would say that the term African equivalent is, in my eyes, is a mistaken term, because this term follows the European norms, if we use the term equivalent. There is no need for, in my eyes, for authors from Africa equivalent way with the European or Western norms. On the other hand, turn its rules and to accept that there are who write an excellent literature with some terms or norms.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Frank is
I mean, we
raising
had
his hand.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Anna, go ahead.
Frank was raising his hand and I saw it and maybe you didn't.
Perfect. I didn't know.
Yeah.
So, Frank, please, please ask away.
A brief comment and a question. The brief comment is, of course, if you look at the history of where the Nobel Prize comes from, right, it's the same sort of story as where the Tate Gallery comes from, right? I mean, these are historical circumstances that are not available, which is not to say that all Africans are good and sort of community loving. It is just that by and large, Africa has not had available to it the history of amassment and plundering that Europe has had. And some of the resources for these prizes comes exactly out of that history. And in that sense, of course, this is a constellation that cannot, and I mean, hopefully should not be repeated in that sense. I have another question that goes right back to this idea of community. And I would like, again, this would address all writers present here. One of the topics in the symposium has been diversity. And it always strikes me that this question of writers and communities, there's very often an assumption that there is sort of one community per writer, in the sense that writers are attached to usually quite old-fashioned traditional understandings or of community, which are very often ethnic. And of course, if we look at contemporary Africa, like anywhere else in the world, we find all sorts of communities intersecting. So at any given moment, we might find communities of those who support an authoritarian regime, communities of those who go onto the street to resist it, and huge communities of onlookers, right? Fence post sitters. We've got, different religions. We've got all. Really, the question is this idea of writers and communities. I sometimes find it's a bit nostalgic. I mean, Chinua Achebe could say, I want to be, the teacher of my people, but he could say that in a very specific constellation. And I just wonder, how the writers present here feel about community.
Unfortunately, I can't see if someone is raising a hand to react.
He's raising his hand, so please just go
wonderful.
on.
Please go on, Nee.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't have a problem with community, the notion of community, as long as it's not exclusionary. What tends to happen is people say you're a community, you're part of a community of Black male writers, and therefore you're no longer a community of Ribena drinkers or orange juice drinkers or muffin lovers. And that's the problem that I have. And that always tends to lean, it never applies to white male writers. They can be, philologists and wife beaters and whatever, and they'll still be celebrated. And with an African writer, you just have to be, first of all, the problematic African. It's African writer. And so, somebody was asking me about if I have a problem with being called an African writer because in academia, it makes it easier for them to select books. And I said, it's not a problem for me as long as when you're looking at writers who deal with history, you don't exclude me as well. Just because you've covered me under Africa, suddenly you're covering history and I'm not there. And that is the problem really that I have. I don't have a problem being part of communities because we are multifaceted beings, right? I can see on this screen my community of curly-haired people, right? It doesn't even have to be according to skin color. I can see my community of dark-hued people. I can see my community of shea butter users. All of these things are all parts of what make the whole. And unfortunately, in the current, largely the current narrative of community, as you're saying, Frank, is, yeah, it just becomes a very small thing. So I don't have a problem with it as long as it doesn't exclude. You know, community should be this thing of growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. If communities don't grow, what are we? Are we shrinking to being alone or to being a single disappearing thing? Maybe that's what it is. I don't know. But not for me, not in my culture.
Okay. Any more questions? Any more remarks?
I would like to continue that thought that you just raised me and steer it into another direction, and that is exactly like cultural or literary programming of events and festivals, be it about you know, prose or poetry or also other formats that are very often within that sense of one community, of one very wide geological you know, belonging that is imagined often, and very linear and very limited, you know, exactly in that sense that you have just described. And there's a continuation of that, and we often see in many literary festivals that happen, for example, that's just an example now in Europe, but especially in Germany, that there's kind of geographical curating is still ongoing. I mean, things have changed a bit in the last years, but we very much have this, and I call it lazy. I think it has very little to do with proper reading and engaging in certain forms. And I often find it also very infuriating, you know, in the way certain poets, for example, are grouped on a stage that has barely anything to do with actually their imaginary or, you know, the language, the poetry itself. It has very broad denominators that, you know, are grouped together, which you would, for example, not find, you know, in a very finely tuned programming and curating of, you know, poets from France, Germany, where it is all about their writing. And this is a repetition on and on, you know, that there is this, what, you know, some writers I've talked about, you know, call this form of ghettoization in the literary world. And in this understanding, there is one description, let's say one community, and that must suffice. And of course that limits again then as well how certain books are approached or read. If they're under this one category in the shelf, if they're under this one category in the festivals, if they're in this one category in universal teaching, or also criticism in the newspaper. And I would be so much more interested in programming of, you know, these festivals in exactly, you know, let's say books that have shea butter users in them, or I don't know, you know, but read them, read the books, and then make the connections and you know, find out the topics that are interesting and how they can speak to each other, you know, across this very simplified categorization of a very broad belonging. And I wish this is nothing that should have to be said anymore, but opening programs of these events, I find it again and again, and I find it boring and lazy. And I hope that, you know, more festivals and format can come up where actually really these sparkles, these inspirations, these shared, you know, histories and ways of yeah, for example, breaking archives and so on and so forth could, you know, be put together in a more interesting way, and in one that understands community in the wider sense, as you have just you know, put it so beautifully.
Thank you, Anna. Are there any more reactions to this, where time is sort of, we're heading towards the end of this virtual get-together?
Frank, Schulze-Engler?
Yeah, Frank, please.
A very brief response to what Anna said. I mean, one of these categories, and that's not specifically African at all, that come to our minds in terms of, is of course the national community. And I think we still very often think in terms of national literature. Although, you know, we have all sorts of clever books explaining why that may not be the best of ideas. And whether it's in curating, you know, literary festivals, but also setting up university courses, it's a routine thing to fall back onto. And in times where, you know, transculturality, transnationalism, living in a globalized world, right, is what is central to a lot of writing that is being produced, this category may indeed not be the cleverest one. And that's not only with regard to African writing, but I think, you know, with regard to many other writings in the world as well. It's a fallback category that is deeply ingrained, I think, in our repertoires all over the place, and that we need to get rid of, or at least to get rid of the stranglehold, to widen things and widen perspectives. Yeah.
Hemley?
Si je peux me permettre une petite remarque, je vais voir si je peux la faire en français. Oui. Dans les espaces où il n'y a que la culture occidentale qui est représentée, in the space where you only have Western culture represented, you have different category. You can say this is from German, this is from France or English, and so on. When it comes to Western and the rest of the world, you have the real culture, where even if it's literature, music, you have music and you have world music, you have literature and you have world literature, and it's also like this. It's not only on everybody has a category. I understand the marketing of putting things in packing things to recognize them. But the thing is, when it comes to Western and the rest of the world, you always have these borders growing.
Okay. Thank you, Hemley. I think looking at the time, we will have to come to an end now, which is a shame. We're very grateful for everyone's time. We're also grateful for the interesting questions that were raised by our guests who were watching today. I think it is clear that there is many topics more to discuss, and we hope that all the different threads that were initiated here will continue. And yeah, time to wish everyone a good evening, I think. Anita, would you like to say a farewell?
I'd like to say thank you.
Anita, you need to unmute yourself first, please.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Yes, I just want to say thank you to all of you, and well, hope to see you soon in a very different setting, not virtually, but in live. That would be nice. Yeah. Thank you, and see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
It's been quite an endeavor. Thank you for doing this with us. Thank you.